Hello, and welcome back to the Hearsay podcast, a joint project between Pro Bono Students Canada, University of Calgary Chapter, and CJSW 90.9 FM. This is a podcast where University of Calgary law students discuss a variety of legal topics with a plethora of professionals in the field. We'd like to emphasize that the information you hear today is legal information, and not legal advice, as we are law students and not lawyers. This podcast is purely for informational purposes. If you do require legal advice, please consult a lawyer, as there is no substitute for a professional. My name is Austin Minnings, and I'm here with my co-hosts, Maya Ebron and Samuel Hughes. Today we will be speaking about entrepreneurship and the law with Dan Wilson. In the spirit of reconciliation, we would first like to acknowledge that Hearsay is recorded on Treaty 7 territory. We would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. I would also like to note that the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary.
Dan Wilson is currently an assistant professor and chair in business law and regulation at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law, and also the director of the Extractive Resources Governance Program and the scientific director of financial markets regulation at the School of Public Policy. Before returning to academia in recent years, Dan was a corporate lawyer, senior business executive, and serial entrepreneur. Dan previously served as a law clerk in the Supreme Court of Canada, an associate at a national law firm, a partner in a Calgary-based corporate law boutique, president of 2 junior public technology companies, an executive in a variety of multinational businesses, and co-founder of several startup business ventures. Much of Dan's business and legal career was internationally focused, and he has travelled more than 3 million miles and to more than 80 different countries during his career. All right, well, Dan, thank you so much for coming in today. We know you're a very busy man, so we appreciate your time.
Thanks for inviting me.
So we're just going to go through a few questions here. So just what are the stages of thought in taking a business from concept to maturity? So if someone is looking to start a business, what would be the core elements that you would advise them to look at when formulating their plan or their course of action?
Wow, that's a big question. I think starting with the highlights, which is, I think you want to understand the scope of your vision, the steps to achieving that scope. Like, is it an all or nothing outcome, or are there intermediate stages that you need that are milestones on the path to ultimate success? In which case that will inform your strategy quite differently, because you want to set up a structure that facilitates the ultimate success, but is pointed toward the first levels of success. One thing that I think people don't consider often enough is at what point can the business become self-sustaining, which again may not be and probably isn't your ultimate goal, but in a uncertain entrepreneurial financing environment is an absolute critical stage. One of the things to consider, in my experience, is that period of sustainability and the traction that you pick up is probably significantly further out than you think it is. And therefore, starting at the start, my advice to would-be entrepreneurs is expect it to be materially longer and more complex to get to sustainability than you initially think. If you're using a high, low, medium case scenario, it's probably going to be longer than even what you think is your most conservative case scenario. And then create a structure at the start that allows for flexibility in getting to the ultimate point of sustainability. Because one thing I've learned is if you start with only the ultimate outcome in mind, your chances of success are much lower than if you start with a more modest goal of saying, okay, we all have a dream end case for this venture. That's initial public offering or a sale of the venture to some big company who comes in and takes out our idea, or building this into some organic successful company. But it's figuring out what is the path from day one, the concept phase, to the day at which, and when I say self-sustaining, to the day at which we no longer have to resort to external financing in order to remain in existence and continue to execute on our plan. And so I always encourage people to start there, start figuring out, we can certainly make sure that we don't create a structure that's too small or too restrictive to achieve the big picture, and we want to be aware of that at the start. We always want to keep the blue sky blue, but yet let's bring it down to a practical level and say, what's it going to take until this funds itself on an ongoing basis? How do we get there? And then ensuring that we have a lot of leeway in what it's going to take to get there, so that we haven't spent all of our dry powder and used up all of our resources believing that we're going to get to a sustainability on day X, and it turns out that we're 100 or 200 days past day X and still not sustainable. So I'd say that's kind of where I start, is saying, okay, let's be practical, and let's know that nearly every deal I've ever worked on the entrepreneurial side is materially slower to achieve both sustainability and the long-term goal than you think it would at the outset. And it's also to recognize that we live in a very different environment than some of the stories that we follow from abroad. The institutional investment environment for entrepreneurial companies is very, very different in Alberta than it is in Vancouver, than it is in Toronto, and orders of magnitude different than it is if you are in Silicon Valley or in Boston or some of those other U.S. hotbeds in which there's such a large pool of institutional venture capital that you have a lot of chances to win. Whereas, here the institutional capital is very hard to find. And so right at the outset, I usually begin by advising, would-be entrepreneurs that securing that institutional investment as their principal mean of getting to sustainability it's not unheard of, but it is certainly not the normal path forward. Most Canadian businesses that get to sustainability do so on the back of people who know them, love money, your family, angel investors, people that that are willing to take a chance on you. And so you both need to be identifying those sources right at the start, and whatever you think you need to get sustainability, probably increase it by a factor of 50% to 100% and say it's actually going to take significantly more than I intended. And all of those are things that you consider right at the outset before you select your method of, your structure, your form of business organization, your partnership group, your founding group. So that was a long answer to a short question. But
that's super interesting. Just kind of how you started talking about the structure of your business and stuff like that. So like if you could get into like the different types of business models and then the different kind of situations that each of those would be ideal for the person starting their business.
Sure. So we always start with the default mechanism, which is a sole proprietorship. A sole proprietorship is just simply a business enterprise that is not otherwise organized. It's operated under a person's own personality, under their own legal persona. There's no distinction between the person doing the business and the business. It's one and the same, both from a legal structure, from a liability structure, and from a tax structure. So if I file a tax return, and I just was doing my draft tax returns on the weekend, you include, your personal businesses in with your personal income taxes, and it all combines into one number. There's no distinction. You know, the business doesn't pay its own separate tax, and the business doesn't, the business doesn't have its own separate identity legally. If something goes wrong, it's on you. And when I say it's on you, it's coming back to you and your personal assets to make it right. If you have a lawn mowing business and you shoot a rock through the window of a Ferrari that's driving down the street and you don't have the $5,000 to replace a Ferrari window, you know, that is going to come out of your hide one way or the other personally. And most people that are doing proprietorships don't really think of themselves as being in a form of a business organization. They just say, I'm just doing some business, and they don't realize the ramifications and the personal liability. And they often don't even think about like the tax implications, and they may not even file, you know, the businesses on their taxes. They'll miss that until it eventually catches up with them. So that's the base form, which is the minute that you start engaging in business, you are in a proprietorship, and unless and until you take a step to change it into something else. Now, take it a step further. I go from doing my business on my own to bringing in somebody to do it with. We collaborate, we combine our efforts. Now I'm in a partnership. And if I have not created a partnership and done a partnership agreement, I'm in a default partnership, the terms of which are defined by the Alberta Partnership Act. And again, many people engage in partnerships in Alberta without ever knowing they're in a partnership. And they may be mortified to find out they're in a partnership. But the minute, what's the test of a partnership? It's a legal test. It's just simply two people that join together to engage in a business with a view to a profit. So if we're doing something for benevolent purposes with no intention to make a profit, we're not in a partnership. But the minute the two individuals start combining their efforts with the goal to trying to make money, they're in a partnership. What's the ramification of that? Well, legally, an individual in a partnership is jointly and severally liable for the obligations of the partnership, and that includes all of the wrongs of their partner. So you better know that other person, and you better have a very high degree of confidence that they're not going to act outside of what you've agreed to, because if they are, again, you're not only liable for it, but you're fully liable for it. Jointly and severally liable is the term we use, which means that you are liable for the entirety of the obligation. So again, if we went to a situation where you and I were doing a lawn mowing business together, and my friend was running a Cub Cadet lawnmower down the street, and two of our employees were racing each other and ran into the side of a Ferrari going down the road. I may have hundreds of thousands of dollars of liability that I would have to personally make good, even though I am mortified to find out that that people are driving our lawnmowers down the street and I never authorized it. So you're liable for anything that happens in the course of your business, even if you weren't aware of it, even if you didn't authorize it, even if you expressly prohibited it and said, don't do that, I'm still liable for it. So what's the answer for that? Is we never want to be in an ordinary partnership. And this is where I start by telling people is the only people who end up in partnerships are those who haven't had proper legal advice and don't end up or don't recognize what the risk is that they're getting into. So we would recommend, I'd recommend to any entrepreneur that it's okay to engage in a sole proprietorship if your business is not yet ready to incorporate. But the minute that you start collaborating with another individual, you need to ensure that you come up with a better form of corporate structure that limits your liability. And that brings us now, just as an aside, I will say there's a couple of forms of partnership that have been statutorily created. Those are limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships. Those are forms that make some sense, but that's not the type of thing that's used at an entrepreneurial level. So I'll skip that today and go on to the corporation. And the corporation, I think we all understand what a corporation is. But what's the prime advantage of the corporation is that it is the business entity form that gives us the ability to choose the level of our risk. So if I'm prepared to lose $100,000, I can invest $100,000 in the corporation. And as long as we observe the legal formalities, I'm not going to lose more than $100,000. I'm not going to lose $100,000 plus my life savings or plus my house. And that's the principal advantage of incorporating. There's several others as well. Especially in Canada, we have a very highly advantaged tax system for small business income in Canada. I'll give you an example. The active business income rate in Alberta right now is down to 11%, 9% federally, 2% provincially. That's a far cry from the 49% that's the top tax rate if you take it as a proprietorship. So if you have a business that's going to be profitable in the range of up to $500,000 a year, you're leaving a lot of money on the table not to incorporate, in addition to you're incurring a liability that's out there. So ultimately, the corporation is by far the best method of doing any type of entrepreneurial activity once you get to a sufficient scale. And beyond the tax advantages and the limited liability, there's the advantage of it's easier to sell because the corporation is its own entity. And there's a number of other elements as well. So you want to get there. The question is, at what point does it make sense to go there? And the answer to that is, what's your resources and what's your scope and how quickly are you going to get to scale? And also, what's the inherent risk in your business? If I was doing something like lawn mowing, it doesn't sound like inherent risk, but people lose fingers, rocks are spit out by lawnmowers, all kinds of things happen that can create liability. I would say you incorporate immediately, even if you have one person doing one lawnmower. Because the incorporation is fairly simple. Any lawyer can do it for you, but beyond that, in the U of C, you can go to the business law clinic and get advised on incorporations. You can do a do-it-yourself incorporation kit if you're adverse to, obtaining advice. I wouldn't recommend that. You probably make mistakes, but it's very easy to do. And it's not expensive to maintain. The issue is once you incorporate, you have to file a second tax return. The corporation files its own tax return, and you're probably looking at about, use round numbers, about $1,000 to incorporate. A little bit more to set up your company by doing the organizing resolutions. It depends if you have any friends in the business law clinic or, that are junior lawyers that can help you, or if you're having to pay market rates, but say another $1,000 to set up a minute book. And then after that, you're probably looking at somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a year to file a tax return. So you're looking, $2,000, $3,000 in total setup costs, another, $1,000 to $2,000 in annual maintenance costs. But if you're running at any scale at all, you get that $2,000 in annual filing costs back very quickly in reduced taxes, and you have the limited liability. So I generally incorporate fairly early in the process, particularly if there's anybody else other than me involved in the business. I recommend you prioritize it, and even if money is tight, you use some of your initial funds to go through that step.
So I know one of the main disadvantages that we've been talking about corporations is this issue of double taxation. So you get taxed on the personal income and you get the corporate tax as well. Do you think that the corporate tax benefits outweigh the overall earnings of investing?
Yeah, the double taxation it's an issue, but the reality is our system is been designed over the last number of years so that it is largely neutral to the investor, meaning if I pay taxes in a corporation on income, then I get a offsetting credit when I pay the proceeds out into my hands personally. So what you're talking about in double taxation is money that's paid out into your hands personally. And in many and it depends what type of corporation we're talking about. If you're talking about your own private consulting company in which it's just you providing consulting services, that's one issue. But if you're trying to build an enterprise value that has more than one person involved in it, and your ambitions are beyond just a single person consulting, then then ultimately you're not going to take all of the available profits out of the corporation immediately. Most people are going to take those and reinvest them in growing the business. And the compounding effect of the tax differential becomes very important there. So as I say, you may pay 11% income tax on active business income instead of, say, 35 or 40 or even up to 49% income tax. That creates a lot more investment capital for the next year than if you were taking those personally in a proprietorship. And so I may need like a third or even 40% less capital because I'm reinvesting at such a advantaged tax rate that that I continue to grow my business. And this is where the tax differential becomes very real, is that if you build a successful business over a period of time, if you're talking about getting hands into my hands as an individual or getting cash into my hands as an individual that I can use, that's one thing. But that's not normally done on an annual basis. I'm not stripping it all out. What I leave in gets continually invested and reinvested. But eventually, when it comes time for liquidity, we have rules, particularly around Canadian-controlled private corporations, that if at least a certain percentage, and the percentage is 85% of the business or of the assets have been in active business in Canada over the previous 2 years, I'm eligible for a lifetime capital gains exemption. And that capital gains exemption is above $900,000 this year. It's pushing its way towards $1 million. It's been indexed over the last few years. So if there was the four of us in this room, all were shareholders in a corporation, and we sold it for $5 million and none of us had used that lifetime capital gains exemption before, the first $4 million of that corporation, if it meets the test, come tax-free. And so I'm only paying capital gains on $1 million instead of on $5 million, and that's hugely advantageous in terms of building, net worth.
So we've kind of talked about, incorporation, when the time to do that is ideal. Obviously, you need a lot of money to start a business. So what are kind of the main methods of beginning to finance a startup business venture, and how can those different ways kind of affect your business model, especially as it kind of evolves over time?
Well, this goes back to my earlier comment, which is recognizing we live in a very different environment in Calgary than some other environments, and also recognizing that the ability to finance startup businesses occurs in windows of opportunity, and those windows disappear and appear quickly and sometimes unpredictably. So if, I've invested right now in a startup, still a startup, unfortunately, 3 years in, but a startup tech company. And 2 years ago, we were talking to venture capitalists and private equity funds and getting significant interest to invest at a fairly early stage. And then the market turned and that window closed completely. And it's just simply not even feasible. They won't even take meetings anymore as they rationalize their portfolios. So windows open and close. And you have to recognize where you are in a window and also be willing to pivot quickly, because windows close very quickly. They actually close sometimes in days and weeks at unexpected. And they always close at a time when somebody says, some expert says, this is not going to change. This is the new normal. That's always for me the piece that says, okay, well, this is going to turn now quickly because, it always does. Business is very cyclical. So recognizing where we are, if you're in a hot environment, it opens up some additional opportunities. Under our securities regulations, you're essentially limited in fundraising to the people who you know, or to high net worth individuals, meaning successful people who have a minimum level of financial assets or a minimum level. And those minimum levels are not small. Like we're talking $3 to $5 million in assets or $300,000 annually in income average over the past years. So these are people who have done very well. But for most Canadian businesses, the source is self-investment, which means money I've saved up on my own and I'm prepared to contribute. If this is your first time and you're, fairly recent graduate, then you're talking about the love money, Love money is just simply those who love you enough to risk their money with you. That is your family, your significant others and their family. Although I would suggest you don't raise money from prospective future mothers-in-laws if you can avoid it, or fathers-in-laws in that situation, because that can sour the relationships that go beyond. But that largely is where most Canadian entrepreneurial businesses are started from. We don't have as big a network as angels, and angels are those investors who are, they're high net worth investors who are prepared to take a risk on startup companies. But if you can find angels, that's a great source. Again, where the angel, you might find an angel just because they're interested in the business you're doing. But largely, you're going to build them on relationships, people you've met, people you've worked for, people who believe in you, who may not be family, but who think that you are worth investing in. And I'm focusing on the you rather than your company, because the one thing I've learned is that predictors of success are both the quality of the individual and their ability to manage, and their desire and their need to succeed and their willingness to sacrifice and put themselves out there when other people might walk away. It's not about the quality of the idea or the product. I keep getting sucked into great ideas and great products that don't have quality management in them, and they just, as a rule, just do not succeed. You could take a far less sexy idea with a strong leader who's committed and willing to sacrifice themselves. When I say sacrifice, I'm talking about putting in the 40, 50 hours of effort outside of their normal working hours. That's the person who builds a successful business. Another thing I've learned is, the person who is looking to be paid to develop their business, because they've heard in the U.S. about people just coming up with great business models and then private equity, coming in and financing large salaries, and they think they're going to be paid to do it, is deluding themselves in Canada. Unfortunately, I have financed a couple of them to my own detriment. Yeah, very expensively, but it is all about the people who are willing to bootstrap. And that is what I would largely say is, investment in Canada is about bootstrapping. It's about shaking the trees, and it is about people willing to put in sweat equity while they work day jobs or work evenings and weekends while they build this during the day. And willing to get to that stage beyond just concept where you have commercial traction and you're on a path to sustainability. Because ironically, it's when you prove that you're on the path to sustainability and you no longer are desperate for the financing that the other areas of financing open up in Canada. Debt financing is a fool's errand in Canada until you are cash flowing and can support it out of your existing cash flow. And again, just in recent ventures, I've had people offer to debt finance companies that are still speculative and are still trying to gain commercial traction. And that, it's great in the moment because it's non-dilutive and it's on offer, but you invariably regret bringing in debt into a company. So sweat equity, bootstrapping, looking for people who know you and are prepared to invest in you. That's the realistic path forward in the Calgary and the Alberta environment.
That concludes part 1 of our interview with Dan Wilson. You are listening to the Hearsay podcast. We are proud to present you with legal information, but please remember that this is legal information, not legal advice. If you require legal advice, please consult a lawyer. The Hearsay podcast is a joint project between CJSW 90.9 FM and Pro Bono Students Canada University of Calgary chapter. If you would like to hear more podcasts like this, the Hearsay podcast can be found on Google Podcasts, Apple Music, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.